Well, thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks very much for coming. I'm going to be talking about this. I might even get round to sharing a secret of who's on the cover. But I believe in capitalism. In 10,000 years of human civilization, we've only ever discovered one system of organization which is capable of continuously increasing the living standards of ordinary people, and that we hit on purely by chance about 250 years ago in one place. It's actually the place where I was born. The first factory on Earth is 10 miles from where I was born, and it's now a World Heritage Centre for good reason. But capitalism doesn't work on autopilot. Periodically, it derails. It is not a system which within itself keeps everything together. And so periodically it derails, and then the task is to work out what's gone wrong and put it back together again. Capitalism over the last 250 years has derailed quite badly at least 3 times. And we are, in my view, living in one such derailment that started about 40 years ago. And that derailment has taken a form which I'll talk a little about now, but then I want to go back to the first derailment of capitalism. So the present derailment has been a slow derailment. It's not been a crash. I don't mean the crash of 2008. It's bad enough. But it's 2 new rifts that have opened up in pretty well all major advanced economies. And one is a spatial rift, and the other is a new class rift. Both of these reversed 200 years of convergence. So until 1980, if we take the spatial rift, for 200 years, poorer regions had been catching up with richer ones. And for the last 40 years, poorer regions have been falling behind richer ones, both within countries and certainly within Europe. So that's a new spatial rift. And in my own country, Britain, it's extreme, where you've just got one metropolis, London and its region, and everywhere else in the country is never rises above average national income. So there's just one core, which is the metropolis, and everywhere else has fallen behind. And the other rift is not spatial, it's educational. For 200 years, until 1980, the less educated have been catching up with the more educated. And for the last 40 years, the incomes of the highly educated have been rising more rapidly than the incomes of the less well-educated half of the population. And indeed, in a lot of countries, the incomes of the less well-educated half have actually been falling. So that's the derailment. And we need to understand why that's happened, and I'll come back to it. But just for a moment, I want to flip back to the first derailment of capitalism, which occurred in the places where capitalism was born first, so in the city that I grew up in and the neighboring cities, Sheffield. And it was a crisis that came to a head in the 1840s. So let's just go back to that time for a moment. So Northern England, these first industrial cities in the world, people flocked there from all over the country, all over the world. My German grandfather moved from an impoverished village in southern Germany to the most booming city in the whole of Europe, which was Bradford. Bradford was boomtown, right? And it was a cluster of factories. So people were hugely productive going into that cluster of factories. And so it was indeed an economic miracle of productivity. But there was no public policy response to that. And if you herd a lot of people together in cities, you get a health crisis. And that built to a head in the 1840s. So I'm going to take us to Bradford in the 1840s. I'm going to take you, there was a Mr. Big in Bradford. He was called Sir Titus Salt. And he was the biggest industrialist. So he was the billionaire industrialist. And he was also the big politician. He was the mayor. He was the local MP. And then in 1849, when he was mayor, what happened in Bradford? Cholera. Thousands of people started dying of cholera. In 1849, nobody knew what caused it, but there he was, the big employer, and his workers were dying on him in the 100. He was the mayor, and his citizens were dying on him in the 1,000. And it seems to have seared his soul, because he then became the first billionaire philanthropist on earth. He invented business philanthropy. He gave away his entire fortune. Partly, he recognized his obligations to his workforce, and he built the first purpose-built, clean industrial town on earth for his workforce. He was Titus Salt. It was called Saltaire. It's also a World Heritage Center because it was the first. It was unique. Right? For the citizens of Bradford, with the rest of his fortune, he cleaned the place up. Parks, schools, all the public goods that were needed. Right? When he died, the response was huge loyalty and affection. His workforce were loyal. The citizens of Bradford gave him the biggest funeral Bradford has ever had. There's a statue of him in the middle of the city. He's still remembered with fondness and respect. That was what business did in response to this crisis of capitalism. And then we go just a little way from Bradford, and we see the response of families, because the two organizations bigger than ourselves that are most vital in a society are firms and families. They are the organizations which, by getting together in firms or in families, we can achieve purposes far more important than what we can achieve as individuals. Right? So that was Bradford. We're just going to go a few miles to another city called Rochdale. And Rochdale, in the 1840s, had the same health crisis as Bradford, the same nightmare. Life expectancy in these northern cities collapsed to just 19 years. On average, you were dead at 19. Right? This is pretty stark. Right? And so these were the new anxieties. You were herded together, you were probably going to be dead, and where in the meantime would you live? Everybody was rushing and there was no housing. And so in Rochdale, families faced these new anxieties, and in spirit, it was the same thing as what Titus Salt did. Titus Salt hit on reciprocal obligations between himself and his workforce, himself and the community. And the families of Rochdale realized the only way they were going to overcome these new anxieties was to band together. And so they invented the cooperative movement. They're called the Rochdale Pioneers. Right? That was the birth of the world cooperative movement. A couple of years ago, the Belgian cooperative movement, which is huge, it's the only thing that works across the language divide, gave me its annual award for citizenship, which might come in handy with Brexit. But but I asked them, how did the Belgian cooperative movement get started? And they said, oh, a team came over from Rochdale to Ghent. Right? So this was both business and families meeting the new anxieties and meeting them in a very practical way. So the Rochdale Pioneers developed mutuals. If you were going to be dead at 19, the big concern at low incomes, were you going to get a funeral? So the cooperative movement became the biggest funeral director in the country. Right? Where are you going to live? Another little northern town, Halifax, built the Halifax Building Society, which grew to be the biggest bank in Britain. Right? These were addressing the practical anxieties that the derailment of capitalism had thrown up. Right? And now we come from then to now. Right? The derailment that began in the 1980s, the spatial divide, which is really a productivity divide, and the educational divide, which is also a productivity divide. There's no mystery as to why these things are happening the last 40 years. Spatially, it's because of globalization. More and more markets are competing on a global stage, so there's room for fewer but bigger winners. And the education divide, because the price we pay for rising productivity is rising complexity. And as complexity increases, you need more specialist skills. And those skills depend upon having had a good tertiary education. And so the people with a good tertiary education are on this up escalator. On the basis of that education, they get these specialist skills. And the people who invested in manual skills with less education, their manual skills are becoming less valuable as a result of the rising complexity. And of course, these two things are spatially correlated because the most skilled people go to the big metropolis. And so the metropolis is full of people on the rising escalator, and the provincial towns and cities are full of people on the down escalator. The Future of Capitalism is it's a proper book of economics, public policy, political theory, philosophy, but it's also a very personal book because, by chance, my own life straddles these two divides. So, I now live in a very fancy district of Oxford. It is the postcode in the whole of Britain with the highest ratio of house prices to incomes. Right? But I didn't start that way. I was born in Sheffield. Right? I grew up in Sheffield. Many of you will know about Sheffield because you'll have seen the film The Full Monty. It was just forgotten that's Sheffield. That's my relatives. Right? That's my relatives, right? Losing their jobs, becoming despondent, desolate. And so I've straddled that spatial divide. And I've also straddled the educational divide. Right? I've got education coming out of my ears, right? But both my parents left school when they were 12. And the rest of my family wasn't so fortunate. So right at the beginning of The Future of Capitalism is the explanation for why I wrote it, which is this. It's a little photograph of two little kids, age 4, born on the same day, in the same place. They're cousins. It's me and my cousin. Right? And we started in the same rather lowly situation, and we have had totally divergent lives. Right? Her life crashed in the same way as my life went up. And the kid on the cover is her grandchild, who I've adopted and brought up. Right? So it's a very passionate book, because that divergence was completely unnecessary. Had public policy been effective in dealing with these derailments, that wouldn't have happened. Right? So, I've told you why the present derailment occurred. It's the third derailment. The second derailment was obviously mass unemployment in the 30s. Both the first derailment and the second derailment were relatively rapidly resolved. We don't still have mass unemployment, right? We don't still have public health crises in our cities, right? They were fixable problems, but the important thing is we fixed them. Why did we fix them? Because our politics was pragmatic. And what do I mean by pragmatic? I don't mean instant reactions. I mean, a recognition. So here's the essence of pragmatism as a philosophy. It's a recognition that there is no one Bible which gives you all the answers to how to get to utopia forever. Huh? We're in a complex, dynamic system that will periodically go places we didn't expect, and then the best you can do is study the local context and work out what will work for now. Huh? You fix it up as best you can, understanding the local context. And that will work for a while, and then you recognize at some stage it won't, because we never get the perfect answer, because we never know everything. Right? And that was the spirit in which both Titus Salt and the Rochdale Pioneers fixed up the first derailment. But why hasn't it happened in the last 40 years? The peculiarity of the last 40 years is not that the derailment is any more difficult. It isn't. It's perfectly fixable. The second half of this book is about solutions to that derailment, right? Practical solutions. And I probably won't have time to go into them, but you can tease them out in questions, right? I've got to leave some reason for you still to buy the book, right? But in many ways, the distinctive feature of the book is that it's not just a diagnosis of what's wrong, though it's a distinctive diagnosis, but it's full of practical solutions using my fact that I'm now Professor of Economics and Public Policy, right? So I've worked out what to do. Right? Now, the really interesting question I want to focus in my last few minutes is why, this time, did we not come up with pragmatic solutions to this derailment? There was provincial areas like Sheffield imploding. Just to show you what I mean, if you look at a productive city in cross-section and just plot the productivity of the workforce, it will look like a pyramid. The closer you get to the center of the city, the more productive the workforce will be. Right? Central Oslo, productive. So you get out to the edges, less productive jobs. Right? That's what Sheffield used to look like when it was a steel city. It had been a steel city for 700 years. It's in Chaucer. The knife was made in Sheffield. Right? If you look at it now, in cross-section, it looks like that. It's a V. Why? Because the population's still stuck in the city, but the jobs have collapsed in the city. And so to get a decent job, you've actually got to get out of Sheffield. That's a spectacular loss of productivity. And it's happened all around provincial Europe and provincial America. Yeah. So that's what this stuff looks like. Why was nothing done about it? Perfectly possible to do it, to deal with it. And the answer is that unusually, public policy got captured by ideologies. So instead of pragmatism, we got two competing ideologies. They were competing, one was on the right, one was on the left, but in many respects they converged. So on the right, we have the doctrine of Milton Friedman and co. from America, and it's a twin pillars. One is that the sole purpose of the firm is to make profits. Everything else will be done by the market. So it's overemphasis of the miracle of the market. The market is very important, but it's not magic. It doesn't fix all problems. And it certainly doesn't fix a coordination problem like restoring Sheffield. And so the Friedman doctrine was the only purpose of the firm is to make profits. It's just becoming fashionable again in business to think that must be wrong. Right? I have a colleague, we're working in tandem, Colin Mayer, his little book, Prosperity, is about putting purpose beyond profit back into firms. We've just done a joint British Academy lecture tour around Britain, and Carl Schwab has invited us to be the entertainment for Davos next year. So that's part of the problem, the ideology of just profits are all that you have to worry about. Coupled with that, on the right, was the philosophy of individualism and libertarianism, that what matters is just personal self-fulfillment through achievement. Right? The sort of stuff I've done in my life, but actually isn't what people are about. Right? And then on the other side of the political fence, the left, dominated by economists and lawyers, the left bought into a really crass model of humanity called economic man. Economic man, which is what we teach in all economics courses, is economic man is greedy, selfish, and lazy. Right? It's a thing called the utility function we write, and that is literally it. And unfortunately, there's disturbing evidence that economics students gradually become more greedy, selfish, and lazy as they conform to what they believe is the norm of rationality. And underpinning that belief is some notion that evolution eliminated everything other than selfish, greedy, lazy people. Actually, if you do the work in evolutionary biology, and I'm now paired up with a group of social psychologists and evolutionary biologists, that is totally false. Economic man was too selfish to survive in groups. So for 500,000 years, he was more or less eliminated. Right? So he went pretty well extinct. He survives in about 3% of the population. We call them psychopaths. But what actually we became hardwired for was reciprocal obligations, exactly the sort of stuff that you saw in the business community, exemplified by Titus Salt, and in families with the Rochdale Pioneers. We're hardwired to be morally load-bearing. But the economists had got this model where we're all greedy, selfish, lazy. They also needed a theory of public policy, and there was this handy, totally stupid bit of philosophical theory called utilitarianism, which said, just add up those individual utilities. Well, we can do that. Like, economists are very good at adding up and maximizing under constraints, so that's what we did. And there's a little technical problem, which is that if the job of public policy is to maximize global utility, but all the people are greedy, selfish, and lazy, you need somebody at the top who will force these greedy, lazy people to behave properly. And that's what you need is saints. And there we draw on Plato. Right? Plato came up with it. What you need is Platonic guardians who will be the boss of the society. Plato thought they were philosophers, economists put him right there, but so the model for the last 40 years, both in public policy and in business, has been saints at the top, who then have the problem of how to control everybody down below. And so the problem is, can you devise ways of forcing these greedy, selfish, lazy people to do what the top saints want? Right? And economists came up with the main contribution of economics in the last 40 years has been called principal agent theory, which says, oh, it's perfectly feasible. What you do is you tie high-powered incentives to monitored performance. Right? That's the incentive culture. Right? And then lawyers came along and said, oh, we can help too. We will write longer and more detailed contracts. Right? And so gradually, people's discretion in jobs has been removed. Right? We're turning into automata with carrots, chasing carrots dangled on strings to induce us to behave, right? We see that there's an annual survey called the Jobs and Skills Survey, and I'll draw to a close in a minute. It's asked the same question in Britain for 25 years. Do you have enough discretion in your job to do it properly? 25 years ago, most people said yes, right? There's been a 40% drop in yes. Most people now say no, right? And so we've been reduced, both in public policy space. You see this certainly in the case of Britain and teachers. Teachers have been transformed to automata, following very strict guidelines of what they should do, with disciplined by head teachers who are on very high incentive pay, and then it's not enough to monitor the teachers, you then have to monitor the children. And so every few weeks, you pull the little plant up and measure it, push it back in the ground again. It's exactly the opposite of what is done in Finland, which is Finland has actually adopted a policy of decentralization of moral responsibility to teachers. Which system works better? Well, we know one thing that we know is that as complexity rises, the ratio of tacit knowledge to codifiable knowledge increases. Now, if you think about what that means, rising complexity, more and more tacit knowledge. The only thing you can incentivize, monitor, is the codifiable bit of behavior. And so the more you go for this top-down control, the more you lose all that tacit knowledge. And so the worse decisions become. And that's what's happened. And indeed, if we compare Finnish children and British children on those PISA scores at the very end of education, the Finnish children are up there and the British children are down here, right? Monitoring and top-down control doesn't work. So let me finish with the new social psychology evidence that we are all morally load-bearing, that we need to get back to a social system in which power is not just concentrated up at the top of government, bossing us all around. The government is not a moral saint. We need morality and moral behavior and obligations to be widely distributed across firms and families. And so this is a social psychology test that you yourselves can try and take. But I warn you, the older you get, the more painful it is. So you do it on your own at night, but be prepared for pain. And it's this question. Write down the 3 decisions in your life that you most regret. I warn you, if you do it properly, it's painful. Right? Now, what the social psychologists did was then group the answers up into buckets. So here's the bucket, which is economic man. We know the decisions that economic man would regret. You know, if only I hadn't messed up that interview with Goldman Sachs. If only I'd bought that house, you know. If only, you know, I'd bought Apple shares, whatever. You look in that bucket, it's empty. We all make mistakes like that. We get over them, right? Because in the end, we're not economic man. Right? And then there's another bucket, which is full of things like, I let down my mother. I let down my friend. I let down my colleague. I let down my wife. That bucket is brimful. We are naturally moral creatures capable of bearing moral obligations. What we learn from the pain of that bucket is most of the time we keep our obligations. So that's it. We've built a society which is derailed, as capitalism does. The tragedy is, this time we've done nothing about it because public policy has been set by these ideologies which have ignored the derailment, because the derailment doesn't fit into their analytic frameworks. Thank you very much.
you very much for this, I would say, personal story in a couple of ways. Even though I think people should buy the book and read it through, I know that you have some suggestions, and I want to ask you about them, and you can answer. And when Paul here is answering, you can give me a sign, I'll note you down, and you'll have the possibility to ask questions afterwards. So my question is, you have two things, at least you have many things in the book, but two of them are taxing the metropolis, and you explain something about the Henry George idea, and then you have restoring provincial cities, which you call social maternalism. Could you explain those two things?
So, social maternalism has two sides to it, really. But the key idea is that faced with this rising inequality of productivities, highly productive metropolis, highly productive, very skilled people, less productive provincial cities, less productive, less educated people, it is not enough to do the utilitarian stuff of just transfer consumption from the rich to the poor. It's just not enough. If all we were was greedy, selfish, lazy, then transferring consumption would be fine. Okay? But we're not fundamentally consumers. We're fundamentally moral actors who want to contribute. And we cannot contribute unless we are productive. And so what has to be equalized in society is not consumption, it's productivity. People want to be able to earn and deserve what they consume. And for that, they have to be made productive. And so productivity has to be, people have to be capable of productivity, motivated to contribute, and find jobs where they feel they belong that will be productive. And so the social maternalist agenda is partly, and this is quite an innovative bit, we are born as babies endowed with an individual brain, right? Think of us by the age of 24. At the age of 24, that brain has turned into a mind. A brain is an individual chemical endowment. A mind is a social construct. The mind is full of ideas that have been communicated to us within a society. Okay? And so it's the mind of the 24-year-old which determines whether they are productive or not the brain of the baby. Right? We vastly overrate the importance of the hardware with which we're born, the brain, relative to the building of the mind. And so you can try and think of the chain of taking that baby to a productive 24-year-old who wants to contribute to society. And it's a chain of phases. Until the age of 3, we know, first of all, we know that in the bottom half of society, certainly in my own country, by the age of 3, there is so much damage that it is irreparable. Okay? Families that have fallen apart, kids living in chaos, by the age of 3, it's over. There's nothing else you can do that will restore things. Right? Everything else is patching up. Right? Believe me, I know. So the first 3 years, there is only one system that the world has ever discovered which will work in those first 3 years, and it's called a family. Right? And we've been very scared to say so, but families have to work. Social paternalism has been a system of bossing families around, taking children off families and all sorts of things, where the state is supposed to know best. The state has so little of the tacit knowledge that is vital in bringing up children, the state makes a mess of it. And so the only way of getting those first 3 years to work is the essence of maternalism is you help. You do things which help the family, and you do them in a non-judgmental way that separates help from supervision and power. It mustn't be a power relationship. So that's up to 3. Then, from 3 to about 6, to my mind, the best system in the world, I don't know your system, but what I do know is the French system, École Maternelle, where it's free, it's standardized, everybody goes. Because everybody goes, the children of the poorest go. And they're socialized. Brilliant system. Then, from about 6 to 17 or so, Finland. Maybe you do it as well, right? Britain certainly doesn't, nor does America, right? And then, post-17, for most people, it shouldn't be university, it should be vocational training. And to my mind, the world's best is Switzerland. 60% of the Swiss choose not to go to university, even though they've got some of the top universities in the world. And what do? They go into very prestigious vocational training. It's paid, it's long, it's 3 or 4 years. It's wildly expensive. Half the costs are covered by firms. Because firms cover half the costs, they make very sure that people come out productive. Right? So that's the half which produces employable young people. And then you've got to have an equivalent process with firms that they generate the jobs for those employable young people in the places where they belong. And that's partly a rejigging of the purpose of a firm to see itself as having a mission beyond just making profits. And it's partly clustering firms in viable knowledge clusters. Right? So that's a long answer to your question.
We will have to let some questions come from the audience, and I have noted 4 people. I'm not sure if we were able to do all 4 of you, but we will start with Camilla Heievang.
Hello, I'm Camilla Heievang. I'm a journalist in Aftenposten, and I would like to ask you about something you write in your book. You write that higher education was thought to encourage open-mindedness and benefit all of society, and actually it's not necessarily done that to such a great extent. It has led to a new moral class, you write and argue, and that this moral class is arrogant and selfish, basically. And I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to get that in, and I didn't know how to squeeze it in.
Okay, and I have another question for later.
To take this one first, and then the other comes afterwards.
Yeah. So there's a danger. What has happened in a lot of societies is that the people who are very productive and very well educated in the metropolis start to create an identity that is separate from being identified with everybody else. Yeah? And I've got a very fancy model. I just published it in an economics journal showing why greedy, selfish people would indeed behave like that. Chasing esteem, you want to form yourselves into a group of mutual self-regard, right? The successful, the achievers. And you distance yourself from the mass of the population. Right? And this is a thing that's happened relatively recently over the last 40 years. If we go back, say, to the post-war era, most people would identify with their fellow citizens in the nation. Not a national identity oppositional to some other nation, but just a sense of fellow belonging. Fellow belonging is essential for building reciprocal obligations, because you have to have a domain of reciprocity. So the magic trio is a sense of shared identity that's as broad as possible, a sense of forward-looking purpose, if we all do this together, make some sacrifices now, we'll all be better off in the future, and then sense of shared obligation. And therefore we ought to do that. We have obligations to each other. And what's happened in the metropolitan elite is that it's peeled off from shared identity, it's peeled off from a sense of shared obligation with the rest of the society. So that as these rifts have opened up, the successful have said, serves you right. Here's the phrase of Janan Ganesh, who's the famous metropolitan writer for the Financial Times. And this is how he describes the view from London, and it's clearly his own view, the view of provincial Britain as seen from the metropolis, as seen by himself. He says, it feels like being shackled to a corpse. Can you hear the empathy in that? The care, the sense of hope that we can bring. If he'd said that phrase against one of the pet victim groups of the metropolitan elite, he'd have lost his job in 2 days. Right? But it was perfectly acceptable to say that about provincial Britain. Right? So that's what I mean by it.
Then another question from Camilla.
Yes. It seems that across your books you write about inequalities globally and nationally and locally. And that in the book it's not just about economics but about ethics. And you criticize the political development both on the right and the left and argue for a hard centrist policy. Could you say something about the ethical underpinnings of your thinking, and is ethics for you akin to diverging inequality?
Okay, so first of all, I've shown you the ethical underpinnings of my book, of my life, right? Is the lived experience of grotesque divergence, right? That's why there's the passion in the book, right? And philosophically, I'm a pragmatist, right? I don't believe in these ideologies of utopia. I believe periodically our system derails into new problems, and then the best we can do is study hard the local context, experiment, try and find what works best now. And that is our ethical duty. That's why the first 5 chapters of this book are all ethics. Right? And trying to reinsert ethics into economics is a vital undertaking. And it's not a romantic undertaking. In a sense, it's a technical obligation. It's that we've misunderstood what humans are about because we've misunderstood evolutionary biology. We thought evolutionary biology had produced only greedy, selfish people, whereas mostly it's produced people capable of and expecting to bear obligations to others in a group. And then the political challenge is to build that group as big as possible. And in practice, for most things, the biggest we can possibly build is the nation. But the nation's pretty good because that's where our policies are set. And so if we can get a sense of we for the nation, we can get policies at the nation level which actually keep the society inclusive. Norway's done a pretty good job of that, I must say. My own country's done a pretty disastrous job of it. And what that produces in the end is mutinies. We've had the mutiny of Brexit and the mutiny of Trump, and we're about to see the mutiny of Le Pen and so forth around Europe, right? These mutinies are not things to be sneered at. As with all mutinies, they're not forward-looking, they don't have solutions, but they're outbursts of anger through prolonged neglect and disdain.
We'll have to invite you back to the 17th of May in a couple of weeks. I'll let another journalist here from Finansavisen.
Jonne fra Fjordfinansavisen. Did I understand you correctly if you said that poor countries are falling behind richer countries? I would assume that it was quite the opposite of the last 40 years. Sure. If you look at Italy, a rich country which is stagnating, and several poorer countries around the world.
Okay, so part of the book, but it's not part I've talked about here, is the rich-poor nation divide. That's, if you like, my day job for the last 40 years, right? That's my book, The Bottom Billion Onwards, right? And it's a bit less optimistic than you imply, because poor countries haven't been catching up with rich ones. Middle-income countries, like China and India, have been catching up with rich ones, but the poorest countries haven't. I'm sorry, the poorest countries, which I've measured 60 of them, have continued to fall behind even over the last 15 years. I've got a new book coming out which is ready to go as soon as people stop buying The Future of Capitalism. But my publishers won't publish the next one whilst they're selling the old one. But unfortunately, so I've measured this, and I'm sorry, but the billion people in the poorest countries are falling further behind everywhere else, even over the last 15 years, when they've been doing seemingly rather well. Right? So, sorry, but facts are facts.
I still have 3 more people wanting to ask questions, and if you're being really brief, and if you, Paul, comply with briefness,
Sure.
1 minute,
Sure.
then I think everybody can have their questions and answers before we close off. So the first question is there.
Hello, my name is Øystein. I'm from SOS Children's Villages. You say in your book that monitoring is to paternalism as mentoring is to maternalism. But on the other side, we have in Norway a state and a government that has a really strong obligation to every child and to raise up, and to give them a proper well-being, so to say. So, how far should we go to save children in vulnerable families, in regard in or support vulnerable families? And this is a tension that is between these two lines. If you can elaborate.
Yeah. Believe me, I know a lot about this, right? Because I've lived it, right? And it's hard. Right? So we're dealing with very, very complex stuff which has enormous amounts of specificity, family by family. And so the right thing to do is to run a social system in which the social worker who has the point of contact with the family is given a lot of discretion, because they've built the tacit knowledge. Those social workers need to be built into positions of great respect, of great knowledge. Right? There's some evidence, for example, that the best people to do that are, forgive me, but women of a certain age. Right? Grandmothers are very good at this. Right? What we've actually got, certainly in Britain, is the opposite of that. Directors of social services are terrified that some scandal will break out and that they will be held responsible for it. And so the whole system is run as a completely top-down tick-box performance. Right? Right?
Okay.
I've got 2 adopted kids. Fortunately, they're my relatives, and there was a little legal loophole we were able to use. Right? In the whole country, in the year we managed to get 2 kids, there were only 60 children adopted. Right? There's 70,000 children in Britain taken off their parents. Right? My little daughter was taken off her mother at birth, and her mother was told 3 months before birth she's going to be removed at birth. Can you imagine what that does to a pregnant mother? Right? Those of you who are women might imagine that. What does it do to your stress levels in late pregnancy? Right? We know from serious scientific studies, especially after 9/11 in New York, that when late pregnant women face severe stress, the fetus is permanently damaged. Right? This is completely crass. And yet that's what the top-down policies have produced, things like that. Right? 40-page questionnaires. We were subject to this. 40-page questionnaires. You know, do you remove all your electric plugs in the house every night? Do you?
No. I think that we have 2 more questions. They have to be really brief, and the answers, if you want to go to the interview,
carry on.
will have to be brief. So one question there first, and then another one here.
Thank you. My question to you is the following. From what you've stated, it seems to me that you must be pro-Brexiter, and you must also be for mercantilist policies. And the reason for this is it's hard with multinational companies not having a national or local loyalty and be willing to shop between countries for location. There is issues around them. And on the other hand, if you look at the pyramid versus the V, when you look at it globally, as you were saying, it looks as if the center of the world is more is sinking. UK sinking, Italy sinking, the India and the Chinas of this world are rising, and you see the issues.
Yeah.
This is a big question, so you have to...
First of all, I'm not pro-Brexit. I think the Brexit vote is very understandable given the rage and neglect, but as all mutinies don't have the answer. Right? The most famous mutiny, I think, in the world is the Mutiny on the Bounty, which was a bunch of sailors who were on a boat with a load of breadfruit being taken to Britain, and there was scarce drinking water, and the drinking water was being used to keep the breadfruit alive rather than the sailors alive. And they felt that was unreasonable, and quite possibly I would too. What they didn't mutiny for was where they ended up, on a little island called Pitcairn in the middle of nowhere. And that is what Brexit is going to produce. We're going to be on a little island in the middle of nowhere, right? So you can be, but I sympathize with the rage. Your point about multinationals getting free of any jurisdiction is a very serious matter. And the right answer to that, on Monday I was at the OECD discussing this with the OECD, the right answer to that is that we have to club together more as nations so that we can actually start to regulate properly and tax these multinational companies which are at the moment avoiding tax and avoiding all regulation. We're in great danger of having some massive monopoly private monopoly utilities. That is what Amazon, Google, and so on are like. We know from the 19th century, private monopoly utilities are really dumb, right? And so we have to collectively organize public policy to prevent that. But it does require cooperation.
Then we have a final question here.
The divergence and mutinies you describe, to what extent would you blame the two-party systems? Thanks.
Yes, the two-party system worked okay for a long time when both parties were basically pragmatic. And if you look at certainly Britain and America in the period 1945 to 1965, there was little difference between them. They both converged. The National Health Service in Britain was devised by the Liberals, implemented by Labour, and sustained by Conservative. I mean, it was, there was a lot of sensible competition about the details of policy, and you could choose between two teams to say which is the best team at the moment, but neither of them were really ideological. Now, we've got this crazy structure in Britain where 1% of the population is members of the political parties. 1%. We are ruled by the 1%. Who are those 1%? They're the ideological nutcases. Right? And they're age-specific, so the Conservatives are run by ideological nutcases who are geriatrics, and the Labour Party is run by ideological idiots who are children. Right? And then the other 99% of us get to choose. Do you want the lunatic of the children or the lunatic of the geriatrics? Right? That's what doesn't work.
That's a really, personal and strong statement for you to end on. So I will just give a warm applause and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
I will also let your headset be removed now. When I come, the headset, you can take off the headset, so you don't walk away with that one. And then I will just say that the next Civita breakfast will be next Wednesday, and we will discuss the European Parliament election. And for more information, have a look at civita.no. And thanks you all for coming today, and we will let just calmly and organized let Paul Collier leave, and then you could leave afterwards. Thank you all for coming.
Just before I run away and you run away and they grab the microphone off me, please become ambassadors for this stuff. Right?